Hello.
So after college, he went and worked in the villages of Maharashtra, and then with some learnings, he came back to the city and became one of the founder members of the Center for Education and Documentation. Among other things, he has been a software developer and a producer and director of documentary films. In 1992, Aspi came across Buddhism and has since considered himself a Buddhist. With apologies to the Shanti Deva, he likes to say that he would like to be a thorn in the side of the people who need a thorn in their side. So in today's talk on Buddhism, well-being and harmony, he's going to look at answering some questions for us that come out of what seems to be a disconnect between the comprehension of issues of change, climate change and the ecological crisis, and the real-life engagement of many practicing Buddhists with these issues.
Just addition to my bio, because people mentioned the Soka Gakkai. So I was actually introduced in 1992 to Buddhism through the organization in India called the Bharat Soka Gakkai. And I was with it for 8-10 years while I was undergoing my phase of suffering, having been accused of dacoity, theft of property, breaking into property, to get me out of a rented house, basically. So those 10 years of suffering brought me to Buddhism, because people ask, how did you get into Buddhism? And there are 3 doors, like the Bhagavad Gita. The suffering, the door of suffering, the door of knowledge, the door of karma. So I went into Buddhism through the door of suffering. In the Soka Gakkai, I slowly became a thorn in their sides, because there was, at least in India, in those days in the organization, the sort of understanding that we have the absolute truth. All other Buddhists also are on the wrong track. Dalai Lama doesn't know much about Buddhism, but we know what is true Buddhism. And one of the I'm not sure it is there today. I'm talking of 16 years ago, but this was my experience then. So we were not allowed to talk about the organization or introduce other people to the organization. And who were the excluded? Muslims, Sikhs, Hindu priests, all other Buddhists, scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, journalists, because they write yellow journalism, and so on. So I was questioning this, because when I worked in the villages, without knowing anything about Buddhism, when I look back, I think I was working like a Bodhisattva. And when I came into Buddhism through this organization, I was told, you can't work with Dalits, you can't work with these people, you can't work with people who don't know good English, because all our publications are in English. And most important, please don't read anything except what we publish. So I promptly went out and bought every book on Buddhism I could find in Bombay, over a period of time, of course. I didn't have all that money to buy everything at one time. Till now, I have a collection about 1,500 to 2,000 books, which I have now donated to Deer Park, because I have no place to keep them, having sold my house in Bombay. Buddhism, well-being and harmony. Now, sometime I feel, like my teacher, that Buddhism is become a very touchy-feely sort of thing, goody-goody, touchy-feely, peace, ahimsa, and so on. Now, when we have a topic like well-being and harmony from a Buddhist perspective, that's the core. If you look at the life of Buddha, even if you see it as history, or you see it as legend, or you see it as a later written hagiography, he started by trying to find an answer to the question of suffering, or the end of suffering. And this particular quotation which we heard in the previous session, enter with joy into the suffering of the world. And the answer that Buddha found, where he first preached the 4 Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, if you go deeper into that, you straight away come with the contradiction of that question which I raised, and which many Buddhists are now raising. Why is there a disconnect between our Buddhist understanding and Buddhist practice, And whatever we should be doing where it comes to the earth system, to ecology, to climate change and so on. Climate change is only one part of the earth system, where you are talking about the chemistry, the biology, the physical, the geology, the atmosphere, everything. Climate change is one aspect. And the question is there something in the understanding of Buddhism itself that makes us, many Buddhists, practicing Buddhists, disconnect from these issues, or rather feel connected to them but at a sort of intellectual level? And if you go deeper into the Four Noble Truths and why the Buddha says there is suffering, you come to some sort of understanding of why this disconnect takes place. Now, Four Noble Truths. Now, my problem is that I think half of you are experts on Buddhism and half of you are experts on climate change, and it would be very good if you talk to each other. So I don't know what I am doing here. I said to someone yesterday, preaching to the choir, but I think the choir is also in two parts perhaps. So Four Noble Truths, I don't know. I just very quickly say some of the misconceptions about these. Most common people who are exposed to Buddhism through popular literature would say, oh, Buddha said everything is suffering. The Buddha never said everything is suffering. Because if everything is suffering, what about our experiences of love, of bringing up children joyfully? What about all those? Buddha said very clearly, I'm jumping because I cannot go through a dialogic process getting the answers from you. But the Buddha said very clearly, all compounded phenomena are marked by suffering. This is a big thing. First, all compounded phenomena, that is, phenomena that arise out of causes and conditions. Causes, conditions. A seed is a cause, soil, sun, light is conditions. So all phenomena, including the self, which we touched upon in Siddhartha's talk, arise out of causes and conditions. All phenomena. Compounded. Now, what about uncompounded phenomena? Is there anything like uncompounded phenomena? We won't touch that now. Maybe enlightenment, maybe time. We won't go into it because this is not a class on Buddhist studies. But all compounded phenomena, which is all the relative world around us, each one of us, the chair, the table, everything is compounded phenomena. And they are not suffering. I am not the headache. I have a headache. So they are not suffering. They are marked by suffering. Marked by suffering means what? Water is marked by wetness. Wetness is not water. Wetness is not equal to water. But all water is marked by wetness. Coke, rainwater, seawater, vodka, everything is marked by wetness. Similarly, all phenomena which are compounded, because they are compounded, are marked by suffering. That is to say, in the most joyful experience, there is an element of suffering. For the simple reason that because they are compounded, when the causes and conditions move away, because they move away, this thing ceases to exist. So the fantastic relationship with the love of your life, when the causes and conditions for that begin to erode, is no longer the love of your life. She becomes your nemesis, she becomes your bête noire, and you want to separate from that person. So everything is impermanent. And the Buddhists say, the earth therefore is also impermanent. The cosmos is also impermanent. And now you have climate change philosophers writing about the Anthropocene, where they say 11,500 years ago, a new geological era has started as a result of all the previous thousands and millions of years, not millions, thousands of years, where man has taken the carbon content from under the earth and taken it overground and thrown it upwards into the air. And that is a thing which is a question of causes and conditions. So, when he says it is marked by suffering, since we are dealing with the suffering of the earth, the suffering of people arising out of climate change, social injustice, environmental issues, political structures, caste and everything else, all arising out of causes and conditions, we dwell a little bit on this first. And the Buddha says there are three types of suffering. We need to analyze this because, you see, yesterday also there was some question which I was making some comments. You see, on the one hand, we have hopes, desires, and even this question is asked, Because Buddha said, it's your desires which cause problems. You are desiring something and therefore give up your desires. Many rishis in India have said, give up your desire. And then the question arises, but isn't the desire for enlightenment also a desire? So if you give up all desires, then you have to give up the desire for enlightenment. Now this is the limitation actually of the English language. The desire for enlightenment is not a desire. It is an aspiration. In the Buddha's eightfold path, one of the 8 things is right effort or right aspiration. So if you have the right view and you have the right aspiration, that is not a desire. The other important, and so in Pali, Sanskrit, Hindi, whatever, that desire, the word is tanha, which is almost like a thirst. Whereas for aspiration, there is another word, I can't get it right now, the Pali word, but it means right aspiration, and there's a different word for that. And the thing is, desires, hopes, attachments, these are based on false view. They are based on a misunderstanding of what is self and what is the other. Whereas enlightenment and all the other good aspirations, compassion, helping other people, loving kindness, are based on the right view, is based on wisdom, prajna. Now, so the self, does it exist or not exist? And you said it largely doesn't exist. It's a construct. Of course, on this also there are different Buddhist schools, ranging from everything is a projection of the mind, only the mind is real, to the school which most Buddhists now accept as where the Dalai Lama comes from, the Madhyamika school, the middle way school, which says the self does exist, but not in the way we are conditioned to believe it exists. And suffering arises because of the misunderstanding first of self. So I truly exist. How can he hit me? How can he insult me? How can he say these things about me? And that hurt us because we think we really exist. Is this arm Aspi? No, this is my arm. So when I am falling off a cliff, I don't say, my body and mind almost fell off the cliff. We say, I almost fell down. So we think of an I as a possessor of a body and mind, a self distinct from the causes and conditions that causes me. If I become a paraplegic and you take away both my arms and both my legs and I am just like this, I will still say I am Aspi. Because these parts constitute the whole, but the parts is not equal to the whole. So Buddha says suffering is of 3 types. One is the suffering of suffering. Birth, death, illness, old age, my headache, all that is the regular suffering we all easily understand. Then there is the suffering of change. I'm eating this ice cream, it's wonderful, but it's going to get over. I can get another ice cream, but if I eat too many ice creams, I'm going to fall sick. So even the joy of eating an ice cream is tinged or is marked by some suffering. So there is the suffering of change. And then, which is I think a lot to do with environmental issues, is the suffering of change. Change because there are causes and conditions, which some of us are man-made. We have created those conditions. And the last is, now this is really part of, not necessarily this discussion, the existential suffering, which is to say that if you believe in rebirth for millions of past lifetimes, not the conditioning of this lifetime, the suffering of conditioning, the existential suffering of conditioning, that millions of past lives, we have been conditioned to think of the self in this way, and that suffering we carry from rebirth to rebirth. Now when you come to the first noble truth, and when the Buddha says there is suffering, then he has 3 ways. He says each of the 4 noble truths, there are 3 aspects to it. And this is again important to understand if we are actually going to involve ourselves with the practical work of changing the society, world, whatever. First is, you have to accept that there is suffering. Second is, you have to engage with that suffering. And third is to say, suffering has been understood. Similarly, the cause of suffering, accept it, engage with it, understand it. So, now, when you come to the cause of suffering, He says it is the root ignorance. Ignorance is the root. Ignorance of what? Not that I don't know that water is hydrogen and oxygen. No. Ignorance of the ultimate reality of self and other phenomena. That self is also causes and conditions, and all other phenomena are causes and conditions, and all of this is interconnected. Now this is not the new agey thing of we are all one. We are not all one. Because if we were all one when the Buddha got enlightened, we would all have got enlightened. If we had one mind. We are not all one. But we are all interconnected. Like Thich Nhat Hanh, he gives this example. Some of you may have read it. He says, okay, this is a sheet of paper. Do you see a cloud in it? Now most people, not you perhaps, but most people would say, no, I don't see any cloud in it. Where's the cloud? Well, he says, paper comes from trees. Trees go in the forest. Rain has to fall on the trees before they grow. So there has to be a cloud from which the rain comes. Now this is not all abstract. This sheet of paper must have come from one ream of paper, which must have come from one paper factory where a particular log or logs of wood were cut and made into paper. And those particular logs may have been in a particular forest from a particular set of trees where it got rain from particular clouds, not just a philosophical concept of clouds. So if you take away any of one of these conditions, this sheet of paper will not exist. Maybe the paper in your hand may exist because some other tree, some other conditions were not taken away. But then the tree needed a woodcutter to cut it, a factory. The woodcutter needed a wife to give him chapatis to eat for lunch when he's working in the forest. And he must have parents, so he was born. And the wife, they got flour. The flour must have come from the wheat. Some farmer must have grown the wheat. So you have everything in this sheet of paper. You have the whole universe there. But if I say, is paper inherently existing? Can you take this sheet of paper and point to it and say, this is paper? Not the cloud, not the tree, not the carpenter, not the woodcutter. There is nothing. There is no paper which exists outside of this causes and conditions. So similarly, the self is a construct. You cannot point, take another example, an automobile, a car. Say, okay, can you please point to the car? I point somewhere. You say, no, sorry, you are pointing to the doors of the car. Okay, try again. No, now you're pointing to the wheels. Can you point to the car which is not door, not wheels? Okay, let's do an experiment. Let's dismantle the whole thing. Let's put all the parts on this floor. Is there a car? No, there's no car. There are only parts of the car. So all phenomena, even other phenomena, even material, the table, arises out of causes and conditions. And it arises, so to summarize very quickly, every phenomena has its parts, causes and conditions, mental imputation. I cannot take this table and say this is a ship. We have all agreed that it performs a certain function. So there is parts, there is causes and conditions, there is a label, there is a mental imputation, and there is a function that it performs. Then you have a table. If suffering arises because of a misconception of the self and other phenomena, then immediately, and everything is also interconnected, now two approaches suddenly arise. They arose over history. There was the earlier school, the Pali tradition, the Theravada school, and then came the Mahayana. So in the Theravada school, the ideal is to achieve nirvana, to escape this cycle of birth and death, and to be completely rid of all these afflictions. And the afflictions arising out of ignorance are greed and hatred. Now if you look at it at the individual level, I say, okay, so forget climate change, forget political structures, what have I got to do with it? Buddhism is training the mind. So let my mind be peaceful, I will meditate, I will go higher and higher in my spiritual evolution, I will become an arhat, I will have complete peace of mind. And anyway, this world is impermanent, it's going to change and finish off one day. So what role do I have in it? That can be one view. So you renounce the world, you retire from it, you go away. The other view is that we are all interconnected. Now, can you think of a mother who will go for a kitty party to play poker if a child has got 103 fever? The child is maybe just 6 years old. How can I escape the world with my such higher understanding of spirituality, abandoning everybody who is suffering? So, at one point, when the Buddha was preaching, Ananda, his cousin and one of his chief disciples, said to him, isn't it wonderful when all these people come to listen to your teachings? Have you seen these couples, this husband and wife and these lovers, and how they come together? Isn't this love that we see at least half of the Dharma? So the Buddha said, no, Ananda, it is the whole of the Dharma. It is not just half the Dharma. The whole Dharma is about love. And from this came the idea that because we are interconnected, the ideal of Bodhisattva arose. A Bodhisattva is a person, two types, relative, absolute. Well, relative, like we can all have the aspiration to be Bodhisattvas. But which means you have the aspiration to develop an enlightened mind, to bring all other sentient beings, which means not just humans but animals, and even all those creatures in Star Wars on those other planets, playing the saxophone, all of them to enlightenment. And that you will postpone your entry into nirvana, you will postpone your entry, or you will postpone your exit from the cycle of birth and death till every other person you have led to enlightenment. It's a tall order. But if you have that mind of enlightenment like the Buddha did, like we say Dalai Lama has, but he will say, I'm a poor, simple Buddhist monk. But then you are an absolute Bodhisattva. You actually got the mind of enlightenment and you're actually functioning that way. Which is why the Mahayana says samsara is nirvana. So, a Bodhisattva constantly takes rebirth out of choice in order to help other people who are suffering. So now you have two approaches. There is climate change. The world is going to be destroyed. Let me read from the author a little bit, one paragraph. His name is Roy Scranton, and he has written a book called Learning to Die in the Anthropocene. That geological era which they have posited, they are now saying we have to consider this argument. So he says that 7 minutes, it's more than enough. We'll get enlightened by then. So, he says, the situation we find ourselves in is beyond our power to change. Now, you may agree or not agree. The planet, when he's talking about the ultimate, like thousands of years from now, 100,000 years, the planet will get warmer, the ice caps will melt, the seas will rise, the global fossil fuel consumer capitalist civilization we live in will come to an end. It's precisely in recognizing this paradoxical situation that the insights of Buddhism can help us move forward. This is very important. Only very few of us have the freedom to choose how we fail. The rest have our failures forced on us. And so long as the freedom of the few requires the oppression of the many, freedom still remains an illusion. When the exercise of my freedom demands my complicity in denying that same freedom to others, I am forced to take on behaviors and beliefs that support enslavement and oppression, and I lose my freedom in the very same moment I think I gain it. Thus we arrive at the paradoxical truth of the Buddha way. The only possible free choice we can make is to choose to work for the freedom of all humankind, indeed of all sentient beings. Failure may be inevitable, but recognizing that is the first step in becoming free. So we have that Bodhisattva ideal, and Joanna Macy, for instance, says, there are spiritual traps we can fall into. One spiritual trap is, there is a spiritual world and there is another plane of existence beyond this one. This is to be ignored, this we have to transcend. She says any such duality is dualistic thinking. There is no other plane. This is the field. This is the Buddha field where we have to work. And if you look at, this is Sulak Shivaraksha, he's an activist from Thailand, and he has won that what they call the Alternative Nobel Peace Prize, but it's not really. It's got another. Sorry, Right Livelihood Award. He has won, and he's in confrontation with the Thai government all the time. He has to go into exile because they have this strange law that you criticize the government, it means you're criticizing the king, so you're put into jail. Not for criticizing the government, but for criticizing the king, whom the government represents. So he says, when you look at the three poisons that the Buddha talks about, ignorance, greed and hatred. He says, on the collective level when there is suffering, what are these three poisons? Greed is capitalism and consumerism. He talks about the three C's. Capitalism and consumerism is greed, collective greed. Hatred is the military-industrial complex, the standing armies of the world, the nuclear stockpiles. That is our collective symbol of hatred and physicality of hatred. And ignorance, he says, manipulation by mass media, advertising, education system, the way we look at it now, the conventional mainstream, is nothing but propagating and preserving basic ignorance about society. So if we are looking at things from a Buddhist perspective, we can have a choice of changing the world or harmonizing with it. And most of us have taken the option of changing the world. Because if it is a question of change, the question is, if everything is a projection of the mind, and everything is anyway going to finish, and the suffering comes because of our mental delusions and afflictions, why change the world? Let's change our mind. Should we be changing our mind or should we be changing the world? But if you think of the individual approach to enlightenment, you'll say, I'll change my mind. I will have my coffee at Starbucks and then I'll go home and meditate. But if you say that, no, I look at the interconnectedness of things. I want to be the Bodhisattva, not the Arhat. Then there is no choice but to engage in political activity. And I was quoting Warren Buffett to you, that he says, you are not going to solve the problem of climate change by making a better disposable coffee cup. See, all of us do our little bit, reduce your carbon footprint, do this, do that. He's saying, other people, there is David Loy, for instance, another Buddhist thinker, writer of many books. He says, even if 15-20% of the world's population do this individual effort, let's reduce our carbon footprint, let's not use this cup, let's not cut down trees for paper, let's recycle. Even if 50-20% of the world's population does this, climate change will still happen. It's not going to solve the problem of this Anthropocene age. But he says, to fight, even if 15-20% of the world's population get politically organized and socially organized to fight this greed, ignorance, hatred of the state, of the military-industrial complex, of the fossil fuel-based industry, there will be a major change. We can at least hope to prolong the joyful existence on earth. So this is the meaning of entering with joy into the world of suffering. To accept the suffering, to engage with it. You cannot disengage by saying, I will meditate, my mind will be elsewhere. To engage with it, and then to say, I have now understood suffering. I'm not running away from it. Questions?
When you say suffering needs to be understood, there could be, the thought from the rational mind, the logical mind thinking, I can understand the workings of suffering. How does it come about? But that is actually not possible. I don't know if you agree, but suffering being understood is more about seeing suffering for what it is. Isn't that what you're saying? That's what I want to be clear about, because if you get on that journey where you use the logical mind to understand suffering, it's going to get more complex.
From our point of view, see, from the individual enlightenment point of view, you are trying to escape from this suffering in a sense. but by understanding it. But from our point of view, we want to work towards an end of suffering for many people. So when we say understand suffering, it means, yes, even a logical analysis. Buddhism is not against logical analysis. In fact, there is a whole tradition of contemplative meditation, where you will sit and say, I'm not going to contemplate on this Buddha image or on this candle or on this flower. I'm going to contemplate on suffering. So you meditate and say, what is suffering? When did I last see suffering? What did I feel when I saw suffering? Until suffering becomes almost a tangible object for you. And then you meditate on that aspect of suffering. But when we are working in society for political change, we do want to understand that today the suffering is because of the political system. What is the structure in society? Who is the ruling class? What interest does it represent? Why do we not have alternative fuels? Why is the fossil fuel industry so dominated? What is George Bush's connection with Halliburton? We have to analyze all this, because otherwise you will be having false hopes, false delusions. If you do not, the main thing in Buddhism is to confront reality, relative reality as it is, and the causes and conditions which give rise to that reality. So if you want to tackle that, and if you just keep experiencing suffering, you will be burnt out. I think there is another session on why activists burn out. So both are important. There was some talk about right and wrong. In Buddhism, we do not really look at anything as right and wrong. There are no 10 commandments. They are not, Moses was the first one who downloaded the tablet from the cloud, the 10 on his tablet from the cloud. But there are no 10 commandments in Buddhism. We have the idea of skillful means and unskillful means. That which conduces to a reduction of suffering, that which conduces to well-being, that which conduces to harmony is skillful means. It's not right and wrong. Nobody said it's wrong. Your aim is reduce suffering. So do those actions which reduce suffering. The actions which you do to reduce suffering are the right actions. That which increases suffering, that which increases exploitation, that which increases disharmony is unskillful for yourself, for the other. So therefore we talk in terms of skillful and unskillful means.
What is Buddha's perception of people creating their own suffering? Because sometimes it happens to me too. Like sometimes out of fear, I create my own suffering. Some people are like they suffer from sickness, but some people, they're healthy and it seems to me they can be happy, but they suffer out of, they feel that they failed their life. They feel that they are, for example, afraid of discovering new things. This fear makes them suffer, and that they believe that it is their reality, and they create a reality of suffering.
Buddha says very clearly, we do create our own suffering. We do create our own suffering, and especially the type of suffering you have described. Definitely, he says, we create our own suffering. Because you just said it's like an illusory reality you are creating. So, suffering arises from delusion. Delusion about the nature of other phenomena, which is the reality of fear, of falling sick, or you have some sickness, anxiety that it will go into something very serious. All this is based on a false perception of what is reality. Therefore, the Buddha says, confront reality. And then, of course, Shantideva says, if there is a problem and there is no solution, why worry? If there is a problem and there is a solution, why worry? Do the solution and remove the worry.
I will go back to what you said at the very end of your presentation, saying if 15 or 20% of us do our little bit to reduce our carbon footprint, it will hardly make a difference. It won't prevent climate change from happening, and what we need is political activism. So I totally agree with the second part, but I think everybody in this world can contribute to at least reducing our impact on this planet. And I also believe that political activism cannot happen if there is no adherence from a large number of us. Activists need to feel that they are supported by the humble people who try to do their bit on an everyday basis.
I am not totally convinced about this. This was not my argument. This is what David Loy writes about. And I also agree with the second part. And you cannot have a group of 15-20% of the world's population being activists and not themselves following the rules they are prescribing for. That's not the idea. By itself, simply, but we know how everything works because everything is connected. So if 15-20% of people actually reduce their own carbon footprint, do these individual efforts, they will serve as an example. But what David Loy is saying is, while doing all that, also engage with the political and social structures. So you serve both as an example and as a portal through which other people can enter into the political struggle. And that, I think, would make a more sensible statement of that point.
You mentioned that in Buddhism there's no concept of oneness.
We are not one.
We are not
accepted.
One. But how
Oneness
can
in the sense of interconnected, yes.
How can we be interconnected unless we are connected to a larger whole?
Well, I just gave the example of the paper and the cloud. Everything is interconnected, but there is no one other to which you are connected. In Buddhism,
But
there is no
that
creator.
whole big thing, isn't it one whole?
It is not. Are all cows one? Every cow has cowness. But some cows are black, some... If I am a person with a sense of humor, if I ever get enlightened and become a Buddha, they will say laughing Buddha, he's got a sense of humor. But if there's a grumpy fellow who becomes a Buddha, he'll be a grumpy Buddha.
So
Yeah.
both are still part of this one big thing.
No, there is a concept that there is Buddhahood. There is a concept that there is an animal kingdom. But it's not one. It's interconnected but not one. That is... we may argue till kingdom come, but
Correct.
that is what the Buddha taught. That's all.
All right, thank you.
The aspect of Varna Ashram. If everything is impermanent, is the Dharma also impermanent? Are the concepts of Dharma also impermanent? Definitely the concepts which have been created by man in terms of, based on, again, a false reality, is also impermanent. Whatever Varna Ashrama may have been in the past, it has changed. We have to deal with the present reality. Buddha, while talking about caste, he once said, "Oh Brahmin, why do you go into the Ganges to wash your sins away? Why don't you just stop committing sins?" That is the approach that the Buddha took. And Vivekananda, this is the problem with Varna Ashram and this logic. Vivekananda's own statement in his authorized biography, in quotation marks, because they are repeating what verbatim Vivekananda said. He was against the caste system. He said, this is counterproductive. We have to help. He said, supposing there is a cobbler, we should give him better technology so he becomes a better cobbler. He becomes the best cobbler in the world. His dharma, this concept of self-dharma, my dharma is right for me, your dharma is right for you. So the cobbler, his job is to make shoes and repair shoes. So let's make him the best cobbler, let's encourage him, let's not socially ostracize him, let's not call him untouchable. But his dharma is to be a cobbler. My dharma is to teach the Vedas, is to teach the scriptures. So I have to study Sanskrit, I have to do all this, and this is my job. Now the problem here is, actually, the lower castes were not even allowed to study Sanskrit, so they could ever read the scriptures. The unanswered question is, do we want Vivekananda to be a cobbler? What if the cobbler wants to teach scripture? And who made these rules that the cobbler must follow his dharma and the preacher must follow his dharma? These were made by the upper caste. This is the criticism of this particular comments of Vivekananda. You can read this book, Human Love, Cosmics. This is by Jyotirmoy Sharma, but most of the book is based on the authorized biography of Vivekananda, written by one of his main disciples.